Welcome back to Act 3 of Deconstructing Directing, Directing with Kindness. I'm Andrew Robler, the founder and archivist here. So far in Act 3, we've been exploring the concept of reckless kindness and how it can transform our work as directors. In this act, we're exploring why the traditional wisdom around the work of directing being based in authority and control isn't the most effective means of working as a director. Today, in Scene 5, we're going to explore issues around neurodivergence and disability. You don't need to have looked at any of our previous material, but we will be referencing things discussed in Act 3, Scene 1, The Power of Reckless Kindness. With that, let's explore how we can navigate disability and neurodivergence with kindness and make our directing even more effective. If you've explored more of deconstructing directing, you know that one of our key skills as directors is specificity, and part of being specific is defining what we mean. But before I jump into defining disability and neurodivergence, I want to talk briefly about why this is so incredibly important and valuable for us as directors to think about. Facilitating accommodations and support for artists with disabilities in the theater is often seen as burdensome and potentially costly, whether because of the need to hire support personnel like sign language interpreters or pay to make facilities accessible that were not originally designed to be so. Even if the cost isn't an issue, the additional steps needed to create a supportive environment can feel like a step too far for a director who is already overloaded and under pressure to mount a successful production. So, why should we care? We should care because disability is something that almost all of us have experienced or will experience at some point in our life. The reality is that we are all one moment away from an event that disables us, such as a car accident or lasting effects from a serious illness like long COVID. Even if we manage to avoid that and live to old age, our bodies will begin to deteriorate. In essence, those of us without a disability currently are only temporarily abled. This means that working to create systems and structures that are welcoming and supportive of those with disabilities helps all of us, not just those who are currently disabled. It can feel challenging or overwhelming, but that's why this scene exists, to provide guidance and tools that you can use to make your production process more inclusive for everyone. So, hang in there with me, because we need to start by defining disability. And because it's something a lot of folks don't have to think about often, we're going to be pretty thorough. I promise that we will connect this to our work as directors. The American Disabilities Act, or ADA, is a landmark piece of legislation passed in 1990 to protect the rights of people with disabilities. They define disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. As of 2016, it was estimated that 1 in 4 adults in the United States live with a disability, a percentage that has likely risen in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. To put this in context, that means that, statistically speaking, if you have a cast and crew of 20 people total working on a show, 5 of them are likely to live with a disability, a much higher percentage than I think most of us think about. There are also many different kinds of disabilities, and we're not going to cover every type of disability in this scene, but we'll cover the ones most likely to be seen in a typical theater space. I should also note now that none of what we are sharing with you today is legal advice, nor should it be construed as such. Most people know and think about physical disabilities, especially because our societal symbol for disability is that of a stick figure using a wheelchair. Physical disabilities might impact movement, vision, hearing, or other senses like proprioception, our sense of where we are in space, which is not always visible. Additionally, physical disabilities are not always completely disabling. There are people who use wheelchairs who can stand or walk for short periods of time on their own, but cannot do so regularly or for extended periods of time. Just like there are people who are considered blind or deaf, who may have a small amount of vision or hearing, but still need accommodations and support. These are often seen as visible disabilities, meaning that there is some external sign that someone has a disability, such as a mobility aid, a white cane, hearing aids, or cochlear implants, etc. That said, not all people with physical or sensory disabilities have these visible signs of disability. Developmental disabilities are a category of disability that refers to an impairment in physical, learning, language, or behavior areas, according to the Center for Disease Control. These are often disabilities that become apparent as a child develops, hence the name. These can include autism, Tourette syndrome, ADHD, and intellectual disabilities like Down syndrome. Learning disabilities like dyslexia, or difficulty reading, dysgraphia, or difficulty writing, dyscalculia, difficulty processing numbers, and auditory or language processing disorders are sometimes referred to as developmental disabilities as well. Many of these disabilities can be invisible, with no clear external sign that someone is disabled. Chronic health conditions can also be invisible disabilities, like chronic fatigue syndrome, diabetes, cancer, and multiple sclerosis, just to name a few. They are considered disabilities because they impact a person's energy and ability to function in their daily life. Now, this scene refers to neurodivergence and disability, so what exactly is neurodivergence? To really understand that, we need to understand the two primary lenses through which we understand disability, often referred to as the medical model and the social model of disability. The medical model is the way that most people in the US likely think about and understand disability. The medical model assumes that the source of difficulty for a person with a disability is the problem within their body and is focused on fixing those problems, returning a person to a normal state. A common example of this is the use of cochlear implants for children with hearing loss. The goal of many medical providers and the parents is to fix the child's hearing. As you might imagine, the implication that those with disabilities have bodies that are broken and need to be fixed puts the primary responsibility for the care and support of a disability on the individual with the disability and their network of family and friends, with minimal legal requirements in place to allow them basic access to some public spaces. I say some because when the ADA was passed, it grandfathered in any building that was built before the legislation was passed, meaning that older buildings not built with accessibility in mind, like, say, many of the theaters on Broadway, are simply not accessible. The alternative to the medical model is the social model of disability, which was originally developed by activists in the 70s and 80s, though much work has happened in the past 30 years by prolific scholars in this area. The social model acknowledges that there are differences in ability between those that are considered disabled and those who are not, but argues that what is truly disabling is that our society does not prioritize accessibility, leaving those with disabilities isolated and separate from the rest of society. The social model argues that if our society prioritized accessibility, people with different bodies and abilities would not experience the challenges that are often used to argue for medical intervention. In other words, if someone in a wheelchair can't enter a building because there are steps and no ramp, what is disabling is not the presence of the wheelchair, but the absence of the ramp. The concept of neurodivergence, sometimes referred to as neurodiversity, is related to the social model because it looks at disabilities like autism, ADHD, and dyslexia not as innate problems with an individual, but a natural variation in how our brains work. Rather than a problem to be eliminated in favor of what we might call a neurotypical brain, our differences make us stronger and represent the breadth of humanity. But because of the fact that society is still inaccessible and caters primarily to those with neurotypical brains, we often still need support to function fully, such as medication, therapy, and other types of support. The last thing that we need to discuss is the language we use to discuss disabilities. You'll notice throughout this scene that most of the time I use what is called person-first language, such as a person who uses a wheelchair, rather than what is called identity-first, sometimes called disability-first language, such as a wheelchair user. In many contexts, many people with disabilities prefer person-first language because it's a reminder that they are, as the concept suggests, a person first. Their disability is only a part of who they are. Later on, however, you'll hear me use identity-first language specifically in regards to autistic individuals. To explain why, I'd like to share a quote from a blog post by Lydia Brown, an intern with the Autism Self-Advocacy Network, which was reposted by the organization. When we say person with autism, we say that it is unfortunate and an accident that a person is autistic. We affirm that the person has value and worth, and that autism is entirely separate from what gives him or her value and worth. In fact, we are saying that autism is detrimental to value and worth as a person, which is why we separate the condition with the word with or has. Ultimately, what we are saying when we say person with autism is that the person would be better off if not autistic, and that it would have been better if he or she had been born typical. We suppress the individual's identity as an autistic person because we are saying that the autism is something inherently bad, like a disease. Yet, when we say autistic person, we recognize, affirm, and validate an individual's identity as an autistic person. We recognize the value and worth of that individual as an autistic person, that being autistic is not a condition absolutely irreconcilable with regarding people as inherently valuable and worth something. We affirm the individual's potential to grow and mature, to overcome challenges and disability, and to live a meaningful life as an autistic. Ultimately, we are accepting that the individual is different from non-autistic people, and that that's not a tragedy. And we are showing that we are not afraid or ashamed to recognize that difference. It's as a result of this perspective that is shared by most autistic folks I know that I use identity-first language in the context of discussing autism. Deaf individuals often prefer identity-first language for a similar reason. I often default to person-first language for most other disabilities, but if we're ever uncertain which to use, it's often okay to respectfully ask the person you are speaking with which they prefer, and do your best to honor their answer in the way you speak to and about them. Okay, I think we've gotten as specific as we can in this context about the definition of disability and neurodivergence. So let's explore how reckless kindness can help us create an atmosphere not just of accessibility, but of belonging as well. We're going to explore 4 different concepts: access needs, accommodations, representation, and advocacy. Let's start with access needs. One of the simplest ways to begin prioritizing accessibility is to start asking about it. As humans, our needs are not the same from day to day, even if, and perhaps especially if, we have a disability. As a director, we have a larger amount of power and influence in the production process than many other folks might. Check out Act 2, Scene 6 to explore more about how we make peace with that power. As such, when we prioritize something, it sets the tone for everything else. Starting any production meeting or rehearsal with a check-in that invites folks to share anything they need to share about their participation is an easy habit to build if you're intentional about it. It might sound like this. Hey there, everyone. Before we get started, I just wanted to ask everyone to share any access needs you may have. If this is your first time bringing this up, you may need to explain what an access need is, namely, a need that would allow someone to participate as fully as possible in the meeting or rehearsal. It may also be helpful to say folks can tell you or stage management privately if they prefer. For someone with ADHD, for example, an access need might be that they can't sit still for too long, so they may need to get up and move during the meeting. For someone with difficulty hearing, an access need may be that everyone speak up, or perhaps that they would like live captions on Zoom turned on so that they can better understand what's going on. But it's not just folks with disabilities that have access needs. Perhaps one of your artists is a parent whose child is sick at home with a babysitter and they may need to step out to answer the phone if they call. Or perhaps someone is really overstimulated and their access need is that they may close their eyes during the meeting or rehearsal when they're not directly involved because the fluorescent lights hurt their head. Creating a moment for folks to share these needs not only allows them to feel seen and supported, but also helps avoid resentment or annoyance developing if someone has an access need, but other folks don't realize it. In the example of the artist with a sick child at home, it would be easy for a stage manager or director to get onto that actor for constantly checking their phone in the rehearsal room, which may make the artists feel uncomfortable and thus not be fully present for the work. By creating a moment for access needs to be expressed, that misunderstanding is avoided, nobody has to get upset or annoyed, and the artist will be able to be more fully present. A quick note, when you introduce this to a team, it might also be helpful to let them know that if they don't have a specific need to express, that they can simply say that their access needs are met. Saying, "I don't have any access needs" isn't entirely true. We all have needs, and just because we don't have a need to voice today doesn't mean we won't tomorrow. And the language of "my access needs are met" acknowledges that. All right, accommodations. The UCLA Center for Accessible Education offers a definition of reasonable accommodations based on multiple sections of the ADA. A reasonable accommodation is a modification or adjustment to a course, program, service, job, activity, or facility that enables a student with a disability to have an equal opportunity to enjoy the benefits, opportunities, and privileges that are available to all students with or without disabilities, while simultaneously not reducing or eliminating curriculum standards. Reasonable accommodations do not fundamentally alter or eliminate essential course or job requirements. Unlike an access need, an accommodation is a more significant shift to the working or learning environment and almost always requires prior notification on the part of the person with a disability. However, as directors committed to the principle of reckless kindness, there are steps that we can take to make it clear to members of the company, whether on stage or off, that they are encouraged to request accommodations if needed. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but first, let's look at some examples of what are called reasonable accommodations included in the ADA and how they might apply to a theatrical process. A quick reminder, this is not legal advice and should not be construed as such. First, job or assignment restructuring. While an employer or educational institution is never expected to alter essential functions of a job or course, there may be ways to modify a job or course to allow an individual to more effectively complete those core functions, whether due to non-essential, sometimes called marginal, elements, or adjusting when and or how those functions are achieved. In the theatrical space, this might look like giving an actor who struggles with memorization due to a disability a later off-book date, or providing them the text further ahead of time than you might normally. Due to the nature of theater, the expectation would still be that the actor be off-book before the performance, the essential function of the job, but allowing that additional time enables them to participate more effectively. Another example might be among a team of stage managers. If one assistant stage manager who has a physical disability can perform all of the essential functions of the role except, say, lifting and carrying a heavy set piece during a scene change, giving that particular duty to another assistant stage manager or even an actor would allow that ASM to still be part of the production. Next, leave and modified schedules. Now, leave doesn't necessarily apply to the theatrical world, especially in upstream spaces like educational and community theater, where we're not dealing with employees, but modified schedules absolutely can. Modified schedules could mean alternate arrival or departure times, or providing breaks, or adjusting expectations for when certain tasks are performed. This can be a tricky thing to navigate in theater, especially when the presence of all actors at a rehearsal or all team members at a production meeting is crucial to the work being performed. However, there may be ways to shift or adjust a rehearsal schedule to accommodate those needs. For instance, if you always start rehearsal at 7 p.m., but there's an individual who auditions and requests the accommodation that they be permitted to arrive at 7:30 for all rehearsals until Tech Week due to the effects of a medication that they must take at 6 p.m. every day, that might be considered a reasonable accommodation request. Through the lens of the medical model, at least. Through the lens of the social model, it's worth asking whether shifting rehearsal starts by 30 minutes for the entire company to allow the participation of an individual whose only barrier to participation is this accommodation request, especially if they are willing to forego the accommodation for Tech Week and performances, is not the recklessly kind thing to do. Modification of policy. A lot of theater spaces have policies in place that are reasonable, such as, say, cast not being permitted to eat or drink while in costume. A reasonable accommodation in this instance might be if an actor notifies the theater that they have diabetes and thus may need to drink juice or eat a candy bar suddenly and without time to get out of costume. Making an exception to a policy like this is a reasonable accommodation. These are not the only three forms of accommodations, but three of the more common ones that we might see in theater spaces. While many of these types of reasonable accommodations are required by law, Directing with kindness, especially reckless kindness, requires us to do this because it strengthens our work together, not simply because the law requires it. Theater is often considered deeply inaccessible to people with disabilities, both in the audience and on stage. And while it's true that there are sometimes high costs associated with forms of accommodations like providing ASL interpretation or live audio description, there are many other forms of accommodation that we can offer to participants in our theatrical process. The most important thing I hope you take away from this, however, is that providing accommodations needs to be an interactive process. Making assumptions about what someone with a disability needs can feel condescending and even infantilizing, and may not actually meet their needs. For example, not all deaf people sign, so providing an ASL interpreter for them may not actually help. Similarly, not all accommodations will be needed at all times, given that not all rehearsals are structured the same way or place the same expectations on the participants. The best thing we can do is to think back to the skill of curiosity that we discussed in Act 1, Scene 2. This doesn't mean asking them any questions we want to about their disability, but it does mean making sure that we allow the individual with the disability to tell us what their needs are, and to engage in conversation with them about that. In my experience, many people with disabilities are very open to finding creative solutions that will actually allow their participation, rather than having it be assumed that their needs are unfeasible for a company to support. All right, representation. Now that we've talked about some of the ways we can offer support to those with disabilities in the theatrical space, let's talk about why that matters. Representation of disability on stage and screen has long been an issue for the disability community, in part because the historical precedent is almost always to cast an actor without the specific disability being portrayed. In fact, the portrayal of disabled characters, especially severely disabled characters, has often been lauded as brave and challenging acting work. Think about Tom Hanks and Gary Sinise in Forrest Gump, Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man, Eddie Redmayne as Stephen Hawking, Jamie Foxx as Ray Charles, Audrey Hepburn as Susie in Wait Until Dark, Leonardo DiCaprio in What's Eating Gilbert Grape, and so many more. Among many disability advocates, this practice of casting individuals without disabilities to play those with disabilities is called cripface, along the same lines as terms such as blackface for actors who are not black being cast to play black characters, or yellowface referring to actors who are not Asian being cast to play Asian roles. Did you know that there had not been a single actor who actually uses a wheelchair on a Broadway stage until 2015, when Ali Stoker, who went on to win the 2019 Tony Award for Best Supporting Actress in a Musical, appeared in Deaf West's revival of Spring Awakening? Let that sink in for a moment. The first Broadway theater company was founded in 1750, and even if one argues that the Broadway we think of today didn't really start until the turn of the 20th century, that means it took between 115 and 265 years for someone who actually uses a wheelchair to appear on stage. So, why does cripface happen? It comes down to A, the stories about disability that are being told, and B, the assumptions that are made about those with disabilities. First, many of the stories being told about disability are about the acquisition of disability, meaning that a character needs to be able to portray the character both before and after they develop the disability, or the resolution or healing of the disability. Second, many theater and filmmakers do not believe that those with certain kinds of disabilities can effectively perform on stage or in the rehearsal room. Take, for instance, the production The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, which premiered on the West End in 2012 and on Broadway in 2014. The main character, Christopher, is widely understood to be autistic, though this is never explicitly stated in the play. Neither of the actors who originated the role in the UK or the US identify as autistic, and there was quite a bit of discussion in the theater and disability communities about this at the time. One of the justifications given for this was that the production used loud sounds and bright flashing lights to help non-autistic audiences understand what Christopher was experiencing during the events of the play. Some believed that an actor who was actually autistic would not be able to perform in that environment, given that some autistic people are particularly sensitive to loud noises and bright lights, especially in a sustained manner. This assumption fails to acknowledge that autism is a spectrum, as are most disabilities, and just because one person with a disability experiences the world a particular way does not mean that all people with that disability do. Part of the reason that the discussion of cripface is so important is because people with disabilities, especially visible disabilities, are so rarely cast in roles that do not specifically call for the character to have a disability. I don't know about you, but I think I can count on one hand, maybe two, the number of productions I've seen where a person with a visible disability was cast in a significant role that was not specifically written to have that disability. So when the relatively few roles that are written to have a disability are also so rarely given to actors with a disability, it's no wonder that those in the disability community feel so protective of those characters and stories. So how can we, as directors committed to directing with kindness, help improve this state of affairs? The way I see it, there are 3 actions we can take to contribute to improving representation of disability on stage. First, we can look more consciously and critically at the scripts we choose to direct. Why are we drawn to stories that talk about the development of or resolution of disability? Is it because we see the disability as an inherently negative thing, like a challenge for the character to overcome? What do stories like that tell our students or artists in our community who might be disabled about how we see them? What about stories without explicit disability mentioned? How would it change the story if, say, Elwood P. Dowd in Harvey used a mobility aid, or a wheelchair, or a cane? What if Hero in Much Ado About Nothing is deaf and has an interpreter? Or if the stage manager in Our Town is blind and uses a white cane? Adding these types of questions to our script analysis work is a powerful tool. When we know better, we can do better. Second, we can make it crystal clear that we are willing to make reasonable accommodations to our process to allow actors with disabilities to participate fully in theater. This means putting notes on casting calls and audition information, ensuring our websites are accessible to those using screen readers and other access tools, and doing everything we can to support audience members with disabilities who want to come see our shows. And third, we can work to enlarge both our own knowledge and also our personal artistic circles to include more artists with disabilities. We talk about this a lot when it comes to race, encouraging ourselves to examine our friend circles and make sure that we're not just surrounding ourselves with people who look and sound like us. We can be just as intentional about meeting artists with disabilities and welcoming them into our circles. There are so many ways to connect with artists like this, both in person and online. It's important, however, that we remember that it is not their responsibility to educate us. We have to take initiative in that regard. So, Google cripface and read the perspectives of artists with disabilities on the subject. Go to your library and look for books about disability advocacy and the history of disability rights. Look for blogs and narratives from those with disabilities that have chosen to share the challenges and successes that they experience, not just as people with disabilities, but as fellow human beings. And once we start to learn more and bring more people with disabilities into our artistic circle, then it's time for our final concept, advocacy. One of the best things I've learned from the disability advocacy community is the phrase, "nothing about us without us." Once we more fully understand the challenges faced by a group of people whose marginalized identity we don't share, it's very easy to slip into savior mode. We want to do better, we want to be helpful and supportive, and so we end up taking up a lot of the oxygen in the spaces we are in. This is just another way of assuming what support needs someone has rather than actually bringing them into the conversation. It's essential that we bring those with disabilities to the table and advocate alongside them rather than advocating for them without them present. That said, those of us who are currently without disabilities that prevent our participation in theater are often in spaces where there are no people with those disabilities, and it is important that we speak up. In these instances, it's essential that we elevate the perspectives of those whose lived experiences we are advocating for. This might mean sharing articles, YouTube videos, or other media where those who experience that exclusion due to their disability are speaking. It might mean using I language and talking about what our understanding of the issue is, but not trying to put words in the mouth of those with disabilities. It might mean advocating that people with these lived experiences be invited into the space intentionally and respectfully, and then supporting those visitors when they are invited by making sure that their access needs are met and that any accommodations needed can be made, such as making sure that the meeting location is physically accessible or offering a virtual option if necessary or more. Remember, ask them what their needs are, don't assume. In the vein of nothing about us without us, this page on our website will have a number of links to resources and perspectives of artists with disabilities, and I encourage you to start with these and then expand your research from there. Please share their stories and experiences, and then make a plan to take concrete action to pursue reckless kindness. To that end, we've created a worksheet or checklist that allows you to think through your rehearsal process and theatrical environment to consider accessibility. You won't be able to make all of the changes you might realize you need to at once, so start with one or two and make a plan to pursue the rest as you are able. Reckless kindness isn't always easy, but I promise your artistic tapestry will be richer for it. As always, this content is free and will remain free as long as I can keep it that way. But free doesn't mean free to make. So if you have the capability and you find these resources to be of value to you, please consider supporting us on Patreon with a small monthly donation. You can get some fun perks for it. But even if you can't afford that, please know that this resource will still remain available and accessible to everyone. All right, I'll see you again when you're ready to move on to scene 6. Until then, I encourage us all to be recklessly kind.